Hello and welcome to Bring It Together, a new series on the channel where I plan to take the knowledge we have learned and use it in more practical settings. The first 3 videos on this channel were all dedicated to the first turn. We've talked about what we want to do, we've looked at specific cards, and we've looked at statistics behind the first turn. Today we're going to be taking a look at some different decks, talking mulligans, and playing out the first turn with them. Think of it as first turn practice. Here's how it's going to work. I'm going to hop online and find some random Keyforge decks. After taking some time for us to read over the list and formulate a starting strategy, I will simulate an opening hand with that deck. We'll talk about whether it's a mulligan or not and play out our first turn. We're going to do this twice with each deck, once as the first player and once as the second. For the sake of this video, we are going to assume that we are playing in a sealed environment. This is a format where players buy and open a new deck and play it for the first time during an event or a tournament. Other than sealed being an incredibly fun and exciting format, this is important for 2 reasons. The first is that players do not show opponents their deck list per tournament regulations. This means we do not know what we are playing against, and since in this simulation we aren't playing against anyone, this works for our purposes. We will just try to play the decks we get to the best of our ability. The second reason this is important is because I'm not going to be showing you any advanced analytics of the decks we play. This is mostly because we are not evaluating the overall viability of the deck, just how we would pilot first turn. I wrote a whole paragraph about third-party deck evaluation tools, but that rant is for another video. For all the decks I featured in this video, I will be displaying their deck lists on screen. In addition to this, I've also put links of all the example decks in the description below. For those of us who aren't familiar with all the cards, you can hover over them to see what they are. Feel free to pause at the start to read through the list. Take your time. This is an exercise to help us get better and improve our game. Remember our first turn success criteria. Remember what we ideally want to be doing during our starting turns. Feel free to go back to the first turn plays video or the first turn cards video if you want a quick refresher. Without further ado, let's begin. On the screen right now is our first deck, the Swarming Investigator, which is a Worlds Collide deck featuring Dis, Shadows, and Untamed. I will say, this is the only deck in the video that is not random. This is actually the deck that really got me thinking about the first turn of Keyforge, and why I decided to think about it more in depth. And I personally think that a deck that inspires me to go on an hour-long rant spanning 4 videos about the first turn of a card game really deserves to be in this video. Feel free to pause the video now and take a look at the deck. Think about what we would want to do first turn with this deck, and then come back. Take all the time you need. Okay, I assume you took all the time you needed. Taking a quick look at this deck list, I spot 3 standout first turn plays. The first one is Taliga, which can be very annoying for your opponent to play around. The second one is Flaxia, which is a quick 2 amber gain. If you spotted it, Flaxia can also synergize very well with Nature's Call, allowing us to put her back in our hand and potentially get her effect off twice in a turn. And finally, there's Lord Invidious. What an annoying card for your opponent to play around. With proper battle line management, you can repeatedly take control of your opponent's potentially powerful and valuable creatures. It's also 5 power and elusive, so it's not dying to many things early in the game. With these 3 powerful first turn cards in our deck, we have about a 20% chance of drawing into these in our starting hand. Some other potentially okay cards first turn would be Malison, Avinda, and maybe Mab the Mad. Also, the Legacy Snufflegator is a 4 power removal threat with Skirmish. What I don't want to see in my hand are either of our board clears, which are Harbinger of Doom and Unnatural Selection. I also don't want to see E on the fringes either, because I would prefer to save that for a huge swing turn later. And finally, we have many ways to recur our threats with our 2 copies of Regrowth and 1 copy of Exhume, but they're just an amber pip if we have nothing in our discard, so we don't want to be drawing into those either. So we have the cards we want to see and the cards we don't. Let's see what our first starting hand looks like. So it looks like we drew into Binding Irons, Snufflegator, Simon, Avinda, Taliga, Hidden Run, and Sack of Coins. Now, this is quite an interesting start to our exercise. So we hit one of our big threats in Taliga, which is great. Us going first makes her more valuable since they need to destroy her with something directly from hand. If they can't, they'll have to play some creatures, which is amber for us. We also have really good house distribution with a 4-2-1, with some added spot removal cards in Hidden Run and Sack of Coins. My only hangup with this is that Sack of Coins is much more effective at higher amber counts. However, I think that having Taliga down can make up for this depending on how many creatures our opponent plays. If they give us a few amber to work with, then Sack of Coins can start dealing some respectable damage. If I knew my opponent had a lot of spot removal cards and damaging actions, I might mulligan this hand, but in a sealed environment, this hand is a keep. Going first, we're going to call Untamed and play Taliga as our one card. Then, on our next turn, I would call Shadows. At this point, I'm going to assume we have a few amber from Taliga's effect. Now, if I really wanted to, I could Hidden Run Taliga back to my hand if I felt she was in danger. But in this deck, I know that we have a lot of ways to get her back on board from our discard, so I would rather her stay on board and be something that my opponent has to deal with. Assuming my opponent played creatures, I would play one of my Shadows creatures and then Hidden Run them back to hand to deal 2 damage to whatever my opponent has on board. Then I would play both my Avinda and my Simon, and then finally I would play Sack of Coins to deal even more damage to whatever my opponent has on board. In the best case scenario, we would have cleared their board and played 4 cards out of hand. Overall, I'd say a fairly solid first turn. Now let's reset and see what our hand looks like going second. So this time looks like we drew into Soul Fiddle, E on the Fringes, Bad Penny, The Evil Eye, Tantadlin, and Binding Irons. And this is a really rough starting hand. 4-1-1 is a great house distribution, and that's about it. E and Evil Eye are dead cards turn 2. Soul Fiddle and Binding Irons aren't impactful enough, and the Bad Penny and Tantadlin are just icing on the cake. This, in my eyes, is a very easy mulligan. Hopefully we get something better. So this time with our hand of 5, we have a Malison, Lord Invidious, Bad Penny, Tantadlin, and Snufflegator. Okay, so we got the Bad Penny and the Tantadlin back, but we end up with much better cards surrounding them, including the Lord Invidious. Now, this isn't an ideal distribution split, but it's to be expected if we're drawing a hand of 5. So on our turn with this starting hand, I would call Dis and drop the Malison and the Lord Invidious. Drawing 3 cards at the end of our turn, we get Mug, Inspector, and Flaxia. That's a nice follow-up draw, actually. Next turn, we could decide to drop our untamed creatures and hopefully secure 2 amber from Flaxia, or since we have a Dis creature in hand, we can call Dis and ensure that Lord Invidious gets placed into our center so we can get off his powerful Reap effect. Overall, our 2 examples with this deck were pretty straightforward, but I think we're off to a great start. From here on out, I have no experience playing with or against any of these decks, so let's dive into the second one. Our next deck is He Who Begrudgingly Trashes Castles, a Call of the Archons deck with an awesome name featuring Brobnar, Sanctum, and Shadows. Link for our second example deck is in the description. I'm going to pause and take a look at the deck myself. Feel free to take a pause with me. And we're back. Really cool that we got a 4 Horsemen deck. The 4 Horsemen are first set Sanctum rares that always appear together. Unfortunately, none of them are really great first turn plays. In fact, Horseman of Famine would just straight kill himself if he was played on an empty board. To me, this deck doesn't have any really standout first turn plays. In Shadows, you could maybe play a Shadow Self to protect some of your more threatening creatures next turn, or maybe a Silvertooth for a quick Reap. Still somewhat weak though. Sanctum has a few threatening cards, but cards like Commander Remiel, Grey Monk, and Horseman of War all thrive on already developed boards. Brobnar doesn't have many notable effects for the first turn, however they have some big creatures, with 3 Trolls and 2 Kings of the Crag. In my opinion, the path to victory with this deck is dominating the board through sheer power. This deck doesn't seem particularly fast, with no draw and no archive, and not too many actions in general. In a deck with no clear-cut plays like this, I believe putting down removal threats and going for board is what we need to do. Let's see what our starting hand of 7 looks like. So with this deck, we drew into Carlo Phantom, Horseman of War, Coward's End, Terms of Redress, Staunch Knight, Charge, and Sequias. This is a tough one. If we keep this, we're most likely going to get very low value out of Horseman of War, Coward's End, and maybe Terms of Redress. But the house composition is so good. 5 Sanctum cards for a follow-up second turn is really nice. If this were another deck, I would definitely consider taking a mulligan, but I don't think we can afford to with this deck. With a deck as slow as this one, being able to empty 5 cards from hand second turn is gonna be huge. On top of that, this hand also functions towards our goal with this deck, which is to control the board and reap to victory. We're actually getting very good value out of Charge here, and we will most likely be able to kill whatever our opponent's first turn card is. And finally, I honestly don't know if we could mulligan into anything better. The only thing that I could think of being better is hitting a big Brobnar board early on. But I think in this deck we keep this and play it out like this. First turn we're going to play Carlo Phantom. None of our Sanctum creatures gain value from reaping, so there's no incentive to play them right now. And in sealed, our opponent doesn't know that we only have a skeleton key as our only artifact, so they might overreact and hopefully overcommit resources to take him out. Then for our second turn, we're going to call Sanctum and play Charge. We follow that up with our 3 Sanctum creatures for a nice 6 damage to whatever our opponent might have played, making sure that Staunch Knight is on the flank, of course. Because of Horseman of War, we could also fight with Carlo Phantom if we really wanted to, but I would most likely leave him alive as a fake threat for my opponent to deal with. Then we're going to play Terms of Redress onto Staunch Knight for maybe 1 or 2 captured Amber. We're going to draw a whopping 5 cards at the end of our turn and hopefully continue to choke out the board. Not bad, not bad at all. Let's reset and take a look at our starting hand going second. So this time we drew into Staunch Knight, King of the Crag, Lomir Flame Fist, Commander Remiel, Troll, and Terms of Redress. Okay, so it looks like we have a 3-3 split with both Brobnar and Sanctum, which are both houses that we want on board. I'm inclined to keep this hand again, because again, I don't feel like we can mulligan into anything better, especially with a hand of 5. While we do miss out on Lomir Flamefist's potentially valuable and clutch playability, being able to get a 5, 7, and 8 power creature on board is pretty scary. I would pick Brobnar over Sanctum in this scenario because Remiel is only really a threat if I have creatures from other houses on board. This deck doesn't have a taunt or a way to protect him other than Shadow Self either, so I can't bank on drawing into one of those. For those reasons, I think we keep this starting hand. In this scenario, I would call Brobnar first and play all 3 of my Brobnar creatures. Ending our turn and drawing 3 cards, we get Ganger Chieftain, Grey Monk, and Lights Out. So for our second turn, we can call Brobnar again and deal with what is already on board, or call Sanctum to cycle our deck further and develop our board state. Both Remiel and Grey Monk are very valuable if we can maintain this board state. Overall, I think both of our first turns with this deck turned out fairly well. Remember, when you mulligan, it's important to know if your deck can do better than what you already have. While both our starting hands with this deck weren't super amazing or anything, I don't think that taking a mulligan would have given us more to work with in either of these scenarios. I don't have experience playing this deck, so I won't say I know best, but from my first impressions, I feel like we made the right choice. Now on to our final deck, which is Kuratorin Flamme Kent. Another Call of the Archons deck with an interesting name, featuring Dis, Logos, and Sanctum. Pause now and we'll take a look at the deck when you get back. Oh hey, you're back, great. Looks like we pulled a fun one here. This deck looks like a lot of fun. The main star in this deck seems to be Library Access. A card so amazing it is only one of 2 cards as of Worlds Collide to have had an errata, which means that it's had its actual card effect changed because it was too strong. This card now gets purged after you use it, so you aren't able to use its effect multiple times in a game anymore. Still a lot of fun and a very powerful card. This deck, much unlike our second one, is chock full of solid first turn plays. In Dis, we have powerful artifacts like Dominator Bauble and Library of the Damned. Toxin as well can be a nuisance if left alive to reap. and while not immediately effective, Pit Demon can threaten stealing once our opponent actually gains some amber. In Sanctum, we have a Sergeant Zachiel and 2 Remiels this time for some house cheating. On top of that, we also have interesting ways to use their effects, such as Inspiration to potentially get 2 uses out of a Remiel, Sigil of Brotherhood to use them on an out-of-house turn, and Mantle of the Zealot, which just seems like a really fun card. And finally, in Logos, we have 2 Lab Works, which can be nice for card efficiency or for saving our important cards like Interdimensional Graft or Library Access for an important turn. We also have 3 Quixo the Adventurers, which are removal threats, as well as cards that help us cycle our deck quickly. And finally, we have 2 Phase Shifts, one of the few cards that allows us to play a second card on our first turn. Obviously, drawing into both of them at the same time would be useless first turn, but it does give us flexibility and a higher chance of drawing at least one of them. More importantly, I think that in this deck, these cards should be saved for use with Library Access, since playing that card out of house will still trigger the draw effect from Library Access. When looking at our starting hand with this deck, I want to be avoiding things like our big removal cards, which are 3 Fates, Blinding Light, which is kind of a removal, it's a stun, and the Spirit's Way. I also want to be avoiding our big Amber control cards, which would be Pandemonium, Honorable Claim, and Gatekeeper. And finally, we have a few situational cards that we don't want to draw into early game. Troubadour is a clunky card that requires us to pay 3 amber to even use, so we're not going to be able to use him very early on in the game. And Arise, again, like our first deck in this video, requires us to have creatures in our discard pile. So again, 2 cards that we don't want to see first turn. Overall, though, I think we have a lot to work with first turn in this deck, so I think we can afford to be a little more picky when it comes to taking our mulligans. Let's take a look at our first hand. So for our first turn, looks like we drew into a Dust Imp, Mantle of the Zealot, Dominator Bauble, Bat Drone, Phase Shift, Gatekeeper, and Blinding Light. In this deck, I think this is an easy mulligan. Gatekeeper, Bat Drone, Blinding Light, and Phase Shift aren't really getting great value here. We also got a 3-2-2 split, which is the worst outcome we could have had distribution-wise with a hand of 7. While it's definitely a workable hand, I feel this deck can do much better. Let's see what happens after we mulligan. This time we drew into a Library Access, a Commander Remiel, a Lab Work, Troubadour, Sergeant Zachiel, and Phase Shift. Okay, this is better, but still not amazing. The 3-2-1 split itself isn't bad at all. Troubadour, like I mentioned earlier, is not a great card in general, and it definitely sucks to see him in our opening hand. We do have Lab Work, luckily, to be able to archive him out of our hand, as well as Library Access in conjunction with Phase Shift for a nice little combo. While it probably won't be the craziest Library Access turn, we're just going to hope we draw well and try to empty our hand as much as we can. First turn here, I would call Sanctum and play down Commander Remiel so that Zachiel's effect isn't wasted. Troubadour isn't an option because we literally can't afford to play him. Labwork and Phase Shift are both much better first turns, but in this deck I want to save them for our Library Access turn. We end our turn and draw into Pit Demon, which isn't ideal. Second turn we call Logos and immediately play our Library Access. First I would play Lab Work to archive Troubadour since we won't see play anytime soon with him. Our draw from Library Access is Inspiration. Next we play Phase Shift, letting us play 1 non-Logos card this turn, and drawing another Lab Work off of Library Access. We don't have to play the out-of-house card immediately, since the text from Phase Shift states that we can play that card this turn. If it simply said play 1 non-Logos card, then we would need to do it immediately. We then play our second Lab Work to archive the Pit Demon we just drew, and draw into Dust Imp. Then for our Phase Shift card, I think I would play Dust Imp, leaving an out-of-house creature on board for Remiel and Zachiel to potentially use. Our draw from Library Access off of this is Arise, which ends our turn. Not bad, we were able to cycle through a lot of our deck, establish an archive, and we have a little bit on board to work with. Let's reset one last time and take a look at our hand going second. For our hand of 6, we drew into a Pit Demon, Phase Shift, Blinding Light, Shield of Justice, Quixo the Adventurer, and Spectral Tunneler. We do have a 3-2-1 split, with the ability to play 4 cards if we use our phase shift. Both of our Sanctum cards I would prefer to have later, and even our Logos turn wouldn't be that great, since one of them wants you to reap and one of them wants you to fight. I think we mulligan this hand and hopefully draw into something a bit more valuable overall. For our hand of 5, we drew a Sigil of Brotherhood, Lab Work, 3 Fates, Dominator Bauble, and Raiding Knight. This is definitely the worst hand that we have gotten today in this video. Definitely wish I could retract that mulligan and take back our previous hand, but that happens in Keyforge. The odds were in our favor, but playing the game we don't always hit. We just have to make the best out of this situation. We do have a 2-2-1 split, which is the worst outcome you could have in a hand of 5. Unfortunately, if one of our houses of 2 were Logos, then we could archive an additional card out of hand to make room for more draws with Lab Work. 3 Fates isn't the best since they will most likely only have 1 creature down. However, if we hold on to it, it might be able to help us next turn. So making the best of this, I think we need to call Sanctum here, playing both our Sigil and then our Raiding Knight for probably no capture. We end our turn and we draw into Library Access, Inspiration, and Mind Barb. Well, that's an unfortunate hand to end the video on. Bad mulligans happen in Keyforge, and that's just something we need to make the best of as players. Maybe when I was evaluating that final deck, I got fixated on certain cards that made me overestimate its early game capabilities. Maybe the owner of that deck would have went about their first turn differently. The only way to get better at the early game of Keyforge is through practice and repetition. What we did today in this video is a great exercise for you to do on your own with your own decks. Draw a starting hand, think about whether you would mulligan or not, and then play out the first turn or two and see how your deck runs. The best part is that this is something you can do on your own. As you get more repetitions in, you can start adjusting your mulligan strategy depending on the types of decks you are facing. Anyways, thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you found this video helpful. If people like this style of content and find it useful, then I can definitely make more videos like this one. Remember to get enough calcium, and I'll see you next time.